friends. I'm your host, Dr. Dave Layton, and thank you for joining me in our journey to hope. It is my desire through this podcast to bring you information about how to discover, sustain, or perhaps regain hope. Well, in this episode, I'm speaking with a new friend, Sharon Dunlevy. Sharon has found an interesting niche to make a positive impact for generations to come. And I'm going to let her introduce herself and tell us about her area of focus. Hello, Sharon.
Hi, Dave. It's great to be here.
Well,
And I really appreciate you having me on your show.
well, the honor is mine. I'm trying to look at hope from a wide variety of perception or perspective, excuse me. Some spiritual, some secular. I tell people, not everybody's ready for a spiritual situation. They've got an issue, and it's challenging their hope. And so we look at it from all kinds of different directions. And you are bringing about some information today that even though I've been involved with foster care for a number of years, I was not aware that there was a challenge from an education perspective. So I would love for you to introduce yourself and then tell us about your focus.
Sure. So, Dave, I actually come from a place of faith as well. So I actually was a children's minister for 20 years. I went to school to be a teacher, have a background in special education, but just felt called to ministry. So I was in children's ministry for about 20 years, and then decided I wanted to reach more vulnerable children. So I branched out. And with my background in special education, there was a position open for an educational advocate for children in foster care at a licensing agency. I live in Indianapolis, and so it was in the Indianapolis area. And I served about 200 kids under a grant where I would go in and make sure that their educational needs were being met by, making sure that they had individualized education plans, IEPs, if they needed them, that they were getting transportation like they should, all of those things. And so, like I said, I have a background in special education, but I had not specifically worked with children in foster care, even though I had experience around people who had fostered. I had met foster children, but it was one of those things that we all know foster kids exist, but we don't always talk about them, right? They're kind of like in that background, and even for me coming into the child welfare, there were a lot of things I didn't know when I came from that church background then to there. And so I actually did some digging and I learned more about the laws. I even got a graduate certificate from IU, Indiana University, so that I could just really know what I was doing with these kids. And it was really fascinating, but it was also really sad to learn that right now, about a quarter of our kids, when they age out of foster care, are not doing well. They're homeless, they're incarcerated, they may not even have a high school diploma. They don't get through school. They certainly are not going to college. They're not getting vocational certificates, any of those things. They're just not doing well. And that's a lot of kids. I mean, 500,000 kids are in foster care at any given time in the U.S. And so when you take a quarter of that, that is a lot of kids who are failing at life. And it's really because of those educational outcomes. So that was my area of focus, is really on how do we improve those educational outcomes for these kids so that when they do age out, they are ready to live independently as successful adults, having a job, not having to rely on government assistance, being able to find a home, not having children and not having them re-enter the foster care system, because that is another statistic, that about 20% of former foster kids will have children that re-enter the system, and not necessarily because of anything bad that they did. It's just because they didn't have the examples that they needed of how to be a good parent. And so they fall into old traps and old patterns. So that's kind of where I am, is trying to bring awareness to these needs, because we really need to be doing better for our kids.
Wow. Wow. There is obviously a situation, and I appreciate that you're being very active in that. Some questions came to mind. I was taking some notes.
Mm-hmm.
So you said about 500,000 kids in foster care right now. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
it's interesting that you talked about coming out of foster care and then having children going back into foster care.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
I can see you made a very good point about unfortunately the children may not have those parenting skills or at least the examples.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
yeah. Okay. About the age thing,
Mm-hmm.
have you noted any correlation between children that are younger in age bringing up in the foster care situation versus those that maybe come in as teenagers? Because you said they age out, yes, when they
Mm-hmm.
turn about 18, I guess it is, or so.
Actually, it's higher now, and I can talk about that. It's
Okay.
there's a law called the Family First Prevention Services Act, and
Okay.
when they first enacted that, it was to help kids from the ages of 14 to 18 transition into adulthood. And what they found was because our kids are kind of behind, trauma causes actual physical
Mm-hmm.
problems in the
Mm-hmm.
brain, not just
Mm-hmm.
emotional and social. So they tend to have some learning disabilities that they need to overcome. And so they were finding that at 18, these kids were aging out, but they weren't out of high school. And so they raised the age to 21, and now it's actually all the way up to possibly 26,
Wow.
depending on the states. Indiana is 23. You can stay in what they call collaborative care until 23,
And
but it's a voluntary program.
okay, okay. And
Hmm.
it's, I guess it's because they are lagging behind. I hate,
Hmm.
uh,
I know.
correct me if I use any terms that are not
Yeah,
okay, but I can
right.
see where a child might be a slow learner or have,
Yep.
it may not be necessarily I as a child am a slow learner, but there's some barriers out there that I've
Hmm.
got to deal with. And so I can see
Yes.
where there's some wisdom in saying arbitrarily you're 18, you're out of here.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
My
They're just not ready.
Exactly. My
Hmm.
field of study is in adult learning.
Hmm.
And I understand very clearly what you're saying about being prepared to learn, overcoming some barriers to learning and things like that,
Hmm.
that adult learning is not necessarily age specific.
Right.
It's more of a readiness to learn. And so
Yep.
I see that tie in there a little bit. Okay.
Yes.
Sorry.
Hmm.
Okay. And then if there's a disability with a child, say for example, a child is Down syndrome
Yeah.
or some other disabilities, learning disabilities, it might be any number
Hmm.
of things. So you have to deal with
Yes.
those as well. And
Yes.
by the way, I kind of sensed, and again, correct me if I'm looking at it incorrectly, separate but equal doesn't always work, or it doesn't always come into play. That
Hmm.
sometimes I don't know the proper term. A child may have some minimums, but not the advanced opportunities that other children might have, not in a foster situation.
Absolutely. And big ones in terms of education are the extracurriculars. So right now, the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is kind of our overarching uh, education law in this country. It
Okay.
replaced No Child Left Behind that Bush had enacted and then did Every Succeeds Act. And in there, they created a situation where foster kids, it used to be if a foster kid changed homes, they had to change schools if it was out of district. And then so they were jumping school to school. I mean, I talked to a young man a couple of weeks ago where he said in 10 years in foster care, he went to 30 different schools. So, and that's not
Mm.
unusual. So what they did was they changed the law so that if a child does change homes, but they feel like that school that they were in, even if it's out of district, was the best place for them to be, they would stay there and the schools would have to work out how to provide transportation. And they get title money and all that for it. But it reduced that amount of time that they were out of school. So yet foster kids are learning, have often have learning issues, not just because the trauma has affected their brain physically, but it could be they have a coexisting disability. It could be that they're missing a lot of school time because not only are they moving home to home, but they also have court cases that they cannot miss. They might have therapy appointments in order for them to be able to regulate their emotions while they're learning, or they may just be really easily triggered and not have the ability to learn because they're so worried about staying safe that learning is just reduced, the importance of learning to them is reduced. So there's a lot of things that work against foster kids, and we don't think about those things. Like you said, we kind of think that's separate but equal, and it's not. They don't have the same advantages. The other thing, though, is even though they get transportation, they don't have to provide transportation. Schools don't have to provide transportation for things like extracurricular activities, which that might be an area where a kid could learn by being in a sports program or being in a choir or those types of things.
Mhm.
And if they don't have transportation for it, then they lose out. And we know that kids learn more often outside of the school than they do inside the school, right? We learn how to read books, we learn how to study, but what is it that really fuels learning? And it's those things that we do that we love,
Yeah.
like playing a sport, like doing music, doing
Hmm.
art. And so sometimes we don't have those advantages for those kids. They don't, their foster parents are working, and I don't care what anybody says, foster parents do not make money by being foster parents.
Right,
It's
right.
just like they're not making money.
Mhm.
Most of them are doing this because they love kids. There are a few bad apples out there, but it's not the norm. But they don't have the time or the resources, or because, like I said, these kids are in so much therapy and they're in court cases, they don't have the time themselves. I worked with a student who came out of what we call a residential situation. He had some difficulty with anger and stuff like that, and he had
Mhm.
been in residential for many years, but he'd finally been kind of graduated out of it into his 10th grade year. But when he did his ninth grade year in the residential, they didn't keep track of his credits. So he had no high school credits going into his 10th grade year. And so we had to redo his ninth grade year while he was going through high school. We got him graduated only a half a semester or a half a year late,
Mm.
but he could have given up, and a lot of kids do if they don't have that extra support. He had a fantastic foster family. I worked with him really closely, but that doesn't always happen. And so, there is just all of these things, all of these little pitfalls and barriers that cause them not to be able to have those same opportunities
Mhm.
that other kids have. And we just don't think about those things.
Yeah. Sometimes when a child, and I learned this in again working with education, sometimes we might think a person is a slow learner, but in reality, there's a lot of environmental factors going on there.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. You're
Well,
very,
and
I'm
oh,
sorry, please.
no, I was going to say one of the things that we have found, again, with trauma affecting the way the brain grows, is we know that our brains do not fully develop now until we're the age of 25.
Mhm.
And that's that prefrontal cortex here, where
Okay.
we think logically, we can patterns, we can organize our days. Well, again, trauma keeps the kids in that lower part of their brain back here where it's survival and not into where the thinking brain, which is up here. So survival is very much instinct and this is thinking. And so we call that executive functioning. Well, there were a lot of adults who never learned executive functioning. And so as an adult learner, uh, expert, you know that if they haven't learned some of those things early on, it's really hard as an adult to learn them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, we can fix that. We can create a situation where we're healing that brain, but it takes very deliberate experiences to start teaching that prefrontal cortex to overcome the instinctual part of our brain. And so it's deliberate work, and it's very it's very intensive work. And I missed one of your questions. I didn't answer it, but for younger kids, there is a difference when a child enters the foster care system. If they have good parents, foster parents, at a younger, it is possible to really kind of overcome some of this with new experiences, with positive messaging, all of those things. It's really hard when a teenager enters foster care.
Mm-hmm.
The attachment issues, they're not going to want to attach themselves to a new parent. Um, that ingrained, I need to protect my parents, and I want to be with them. I had one boy who didn't enter foster care until he was like 12, and basically every home we put him in, he ran away. And he finally told us, he says, well, I'm just hoping you're going to send me home. And what he didn't realize is he could run away as many times as he wants, but we're not going to send him home. We're going to find him another family. But you know, he can't think that way. His brain was not
Mm-hmm.
developed to the point where we could sit him down and say, quit running away. You're going to go to another foster home. He just, that wasn't possible for him. And I think they ended up having to put him into a residential facility where he could have very strict monitoring until he was able not to run away all the time. So it is really hard, but even those younger kids, let's say a kid was removed as a baby, what we have found is our bodies actually retain some of that trauma. And so they may have been even adopted as a baby. And yet by the age of 8 to 10, they start realizing their lives are a little different, their family makeup might be a little different, and they start acting out. And it's all because of that trauma at the early age. So it's really hard. And like I said, it takes deliberate, consistent work to overcome those types of responses. And when you're in a school where the classroom has 30 to 35 kids, the teacher has no instructional aides, they're working overtime in order to work at night as well as during the day. They have too many kids with ADHD and all of this stuff. It's really hard to make room for that poor trauma kid, right? That needs that extra help
Mm-hmm.
because they're busy serving all the other kids. And so we don't set our schools up and our teachers up for success with these types of kids
Yeah.
because of the way we look at education in this country.
And I can see where a teacher would not have the skills or knowledge to deal with that. Hey,
No.
I want to share something personal, and I don't want to make this about me, but when you were talking, I had a flashback.
Oh, really?
When I was in the fourth grade, I was 9 years old. My mother had remarried and actually took us, my sister and I, out of the orphanage that we grew up in, and
Mm.
unfortunately, at the end of summer, she took her life.
Oh.
Now, I entered into the fourth grade and failed the fourth grade. And
Hmm.
it was years later, I made the connection in my own mind as I learned. Uh,
Hmm.
I did not realize things were going on, but things were going on.
Yeah.
And I didn't feel bad about having failed the fourth grade. Looking back on it, especially, I say that was not a bad thing. I was not
Hmm.
mentally or cognitively, whatever, prepared for that. So,
Right.
but as you were talking about that, those memories came back, and the
Hmm.
impact that they have. And the child, bless their heart, they're
Hmm.
the victim in this case. And
Yeah.
for whatever reason, it may not be I'd say a bad situation, but it's at least a challenging situation
Hmm.
beyond people's control sometimes.
Right.
I, you know, I'm glad you were a guest on my show. You're very knowledgeable about this, and you're explaining it in a way that shows there is an issue here, and there are
Yeah.
also resources and ways to overcome some of this. But
Yeah.
you also said there's no quick fix. This is not an easy thing.
No, no, it
Yeah.
really does. It's going to take a lot of time. It's going to take a lot of people kind of rethinking trauma. And the reality is it's not just foster kids. We live in an age where our kids are so exposed to everything because
Hmm.
of social media,
Hmm.
because of worldwide TV. I mean, when I was growing up, if there were a school shooting, I wouldn't know about it unless my parents told
Hmm.
me,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just the way it was. But now kids know everything. And so the likelihood of them experience a traumatic event is so much larger than it used to be. And so every child has the potential to have trauma reactions because of that. Plus you add in COVID. I mean, COVID was very dramatic, traumatic for
Mhm.
people. And just the fact that we in school was canceled and they didn't know what to do with themselves,
Mhm.
and it was stressful. Parents probably did not behave the best that they could during COVID because you got your kids running around you 24/7. You were used to them going to school for 8 hours,
Yeah.
and now you've got to deal with them all the time.
Yeah.
And so, this idea that we need to be more focused on trauma informed practices affects all of us, all of our kids. And we know that there are adults who have hidden trauma that we've not talked about. Our generation, again, we didn't talk about trauma. It wasn't even a
Mhm.
word. My dad is a Vietnam vet. He went twice, lost his whole platoon right after he had left the first time, lost his best friend. I mean, and dad doesn't talk about Vietnam. There's some underlying trauma there. Now, he's a pretty resilient guy and he's kind of buried it and he gets on with his life. But I do know that early on in my parents' marriage, if he drank any type of alcohol, he would have flashbacks and nightmares. So he basically couldn't drink anything. And I think it was because it lowered that inhibition, right? It unlocks some of those things. So we've got people out here who are parenting with not knowing that they have this own trauma or they haven't dealt with trauma in their past. And so because we didn't talk about it. We talk about mental health now, though there is still some, dichotomy around whether or not people are too sensitive. They try and use those two words, right? Too sensitive, too dramatic, too
Okay.
whatever. But really, we just need to be a more sensitive society around this idea of we don't know what happened in somebody's past, and we can't judge somebody based on now without understanding that it might be a trauma response. Maybe that person is a bully at work because he feels like he's a failure, and so he's taking his anger out on other people. And maybe he was told he was a failure by his parents growing
Mhm.
up, right? Those are the types of things that we really need to start being aware of and understanding that these could be trauma responses and that we need to be sensitive, empathetic, compassionate, words that we don't like to talk about right now, but that's going to make a difference in our society. And the more we can do that in our schools and really help these kids, the more likely they're going to grow up to be empathetic and compassionate as adults.
Okay. Yeah, I know we have made the connection between a child that perhaps was abused in some way and then later on acting out. But I don't know that we always make the connection about just the general environment that that child is in can also lead to some
Right.
things.
Yeah.
And I can hear what you're saying that awareness is critical
Hmm.
as
Hmm.
maybe as a starting place. And so that kind
Yeah.
of leads me to the question of, okay, you've very clearly presented some of the issues and dangers.
Hmm.
Where do I go from here? Because
Hmm.
I really, maybe I know a foster child, maybe I have foster children. So where
Hmm.
do I go from here to helping resolve this?
Sure. So, and you may not know that you know foster kids, right?
Oh
Because
yeah,
a lot of times foster
sure.
kids don't want people to know. You may
Hmm.
have foster families coming to church with you. You may have foster families, eating around you, and they're not always obvious. So the things that for your audience, especially because I do know there are a lot of faithful people out there, is look at your church and see if there's ways to open your doors. And
Okay.
here's what I mean. So, one, foster children tend not to have suitcases, things like that. So when you hear about a foster kid moving home to home with a trash bag, that really does happen.
Hmm.
So how many of us have old suitcases laying around at home that we could be donating to a licensing center? And all you have to do is look up foster care licensing in your area and they will pop up. Clothing closets. They need clothes for kids, prom dresses and prom suits, right? Like those are things that people don't think about. But I worked with a school that specifically collected prom dresses for the foster families in their school, which was really cool. Um, so the other thing you can look at is for foster families, especially if they're trying to work on reunification, they need safe places where they can meet with the bio parents.
Mhm.
And again, a church would be an ideal location, right? It's a safe place, it's neutral, it's not one or the other's home, so they're not feeling like, am I being judged for how my home is looking? Those types of things. So that could be a possibility. The other possibility is just opening your doors for foster parents to just have a support system of some sort, a place to meet. If their church, I know there's some liability things, but if your church already provides childcare for other meetings, considering providing childcare for these foster parent meetings. My foster parents that I work with, they need support. They need
Mhm.
to be able to talk with others. They feel isolated. They feel helpless. And so having that, and I'm speaking specifically for faith-based, I mean, this could be other opportunities too, but just based on your audience, I feel like, churches really could do a lot more to reach out to foster parents in their communities. And just letting them know, hey, we're a place where you can come,
Mhm.
and just, putting the word out in the neighborhood and see what happens. If you know foster families in your church, ask them what they need. Um, like I said, they don't make money on this. And especially like if they have children in that are preschool age, foster parents don't generally get paid extra for childcare. They get paid the same stipend, whether the kid needs childcare or just goes to school. And so that can be really expensive for a foster parent. So maybe that's an area where a church could step in and sponsor a kid or something like that.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a lot of different things you can do without having to be a foster parent. Because like you and I talked about before we got on camera, not everybody needs to be a foster parent.
Yeah.
Not everybody can be a foster parent. There, it's a lot of emotional work, and you need to be willing to put that consistent time into helping the kids get over those trauma behaviors and things like that. And it is a lot of work, and it does take a lot of time, but there are other ways that you can support foster kids and foster families,
Okay.
and those are some ideas.
Um, yeah, the state of Alabama has some pretty stringent laws advocating for the child and advocating for the foster parents as well. Now, one
Hmm.
thing that I noted, and as you were talking about some things we could do, one thing I noted with the North Alabama Christian Children's Home that I've worked with is that there's a requirement that the house parent be given a break periodically. And in
Yes.
order to do that, well, somebody's got to be watching out for those children. So they have
Yes.
some, for lack of a better term, standby foster parents who can go
Hmm.
in and at least be an adult in the house
Hmm.
and that sort of thing. So there's all kinds of ways. And I love that.
Yes.
I love that you've approached it because I tell people, hey, what's in your hands? What do you know? What can you do? There is something you can do if you'll,
Yeah.
and I like that you could say, hey, talk to the foster parents. They'll tell you, here's what I need. And
Yeah.
it's not always money. It's not
No.
always money.
No.
Um,
No,
uh,
it's a lot of times it is that support. What we have in Indiana is we call them respite foster parents.
okay.
So you could get your license as a foster parent and not have to take kids on a regular basis, but say, hey, I will take kids when somebody needs a break. And it's
Hmm.
called a respite foster
Okay.
parent. So yeah, and I know several states have different ways of doing that, that you can get that license just to be that respite person. And
Yeah.
then you don't worry so much about what you and I were talking about before we went on camera, that challenge of becoming so attached to a kid that you can't see them leave you. But you could still be a foster parent by being providing respite care or the foster parents have to take trainings every year. They have certain amount of training hours they have to complete. And they often need childcare during those trainings. So that's another way that you
Okay.
could, yeah. Hmm.
Wow. Now, my podcast is about helping people discover, sustain, or regain hope. And so
Hmm.
the underlying question of all of this is, how do you, as an advocate, or other folks perhaps related to this, help
Hmm.
in bringing about this in children? Because, you know,
Yeah.
hope is so incredibly critical, and the
Hmm.
greater our hope, the greater our view of the future,
Yeah.
more hopeless we are, the less, and you know, I'm
Hmm.
sorry, I'm talking too much, but it's just like
No.
there's so much stacked against a child,
Hmm.
and now you add all of these environmental things to it. It's
Yeah.
incredible. So,
Yeah.
so
So,
yeah, speak to that just a little bit, please.
yeah. So it's going to sound a little counterintuitive, but in order to bring hope to the child, we need to bring hope to the parents,
Okay,
right?
sure.
I mean, who's influencing the child the most? It's going to be
Hmm.
the adults around them.
Hmm.
And so a lot of what I do is training foster parents. And one of the things I train them on is self-care. And I do this in various ways. So I'm actually going to be talking next month. I have a training already set up, and I'm going to be talking to them about what does secondary trauma look like. So basically caregivers can get secondary trauma by working with people with trauma. It's kind of a vicarious, you get trauma vicariously because you're so exposed to what these kids have gone through. And then what happens is you burn out. And so I'm talking to them about how do you take those breaks. And so I always encourage foster parents, don't take a kid right after one goes home. Take a break. Give
Mm.
yourself a little bit of
Okay.
chance to grieve for that kid. And licensing agencies don't like to hear that because they have too many kids. But the foster parents, if they don't fill their cups, they're not going to be able to care for those kids.
Hmm.
It's the airplane metaphor, right? Put
Well,
your
I think
mask on
that's,
first,
yeah,
you know?
that is,
Yeah,
yeah, that is so important, and not just
yeah,
in this, but in other areas as well. Yes,
right. The other
I
thing
like that. Put
is,
your mask on first.
yeah, put your mask on first. And then the other thing is, we as a society, but especially as adults, we tend to look for the negatives more than the positives.
Hmm.
And so I'm constantly training my foster parents on, for every correction you give a kid, give them three praises. And when I say praises, I don't mean just good job. I mean really praise what they did so they know you're paying attention. So, for example, if you've got a kid in your home who just hates doing math and really fights it over and over, and yet one day they sit down and they do their math homework without you having to bug
Hmm.
them, say, awesome, I just saw you do your math homework and I didn't even have to bug you. It sounds silly, but it's important for kids to
Hmm.
know that we see those positives. And what happens is the more we focus on the positives, the less we're going to see the negatives. And the more the kids are going to focus on the positives and less they're going to see the negatives.
Hmm.
Because let's be real, these kids, they've been told over and over again that they're the reason that their families fell apart. They're the reason or they feel like they're the reason. And like you said earlier, they're the victims, but we tend to blame them sometimes, or they blame themselves.
Mm, yeah.
So really, really focus on those positives. Help them see the good in themselves. Even if they are really bad at school, but man, they are an incredible artist, focus on that and let them focus on that. When I became the educational advocate at that licensing agency I was telling you about, um, the one director, she wanted me to get all the C kids all the way up to A's. And I was like, no, I want to get the D and F kids up to C's, right?
Whew.
The C kids don't bother me. It's the ones that are down
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
And that wasn't a realistic goal. And so I really had to kind of retrain some of them to think about that. Yeah, it's not about a D or an F or an A or a B. It is about the progress. So I had one boy who, when I took over his case, he was at 20%, literally, in every subject. Well, he got up to like 40 or 50%, which was still an F. But that was a 20 to 30 gap jump in percentage. Huge. But he couldn't see it because all he could see was that F.
Mm.
And I really had to work hard with him to
Hmm.
understand, look at how much progress you made. I know it's still an F, but you have come so far and done
Hmm.
so much. And he just kept telling me he was never going to do well in school. He's no good at anything. But if he came to visit the office where all of our computers are locked, he would hack into the computer behind me every single time. I mean, this kid had a brain on him,
Hmm.
but it wasn't in school subjects. And so, yeah, really focus on those positives. And it changes all of our outlooks, right? When we
Yeah.
look for the good in people, and the more we look for the good in people, the more we'll see it. And so we can give that hope to kids by looking for the good in them because they don't always feel like they have a future.
Yeah.
And so, we want to give them that sense of future. And so that's what I would say.
Okay. Something that I like to do, it's just a personal thing I like to do, is I like to, when we're out shopping or at a restaurant, I like to watch the interaction between a dad and his child. Um,
Hmm.
Last week, last Sunday, my wife and I went to our favorite restaurant after our worship service, and I saw not the dad, but I saw a young lady interacting with a young boy that was probably, I don't know, 9 years old, 8 or 9 years old. And it was amazing to see the reaction of that child based on the reaction of that young lady. She was probably in her mid-20s, and I mentioned to my wife about it. I said, I speculate she's a teacher. Um, they were standing at the counter getting ready to come into the restaurant. They were there in line, and apparently they knew each other.
Mm.
But this young boy was talking to her, and she was focused on him, and she was smiling, and this kid was just worshiping her. That
Hmm.
that interaction between the two, and
Yeah.
it brings a smile to my face.
Yeah.
And there's been many times where I've told the server, I want to buy that family's dinner, and
Hmm.
don't tell them, just let
Right.
them do that, because I love seeing dads be good dads, because that's so
Hmm.
critical. All right,
Yeah.
that's way off the subject. I'm sorry, but
No, it's not though, because I've been reading this book and it's interesting the way facial expressions
mhm,
can cut through trauma.
mhm, sure.
Having a pleasant smile on your face and, just smiling at a kid, making eye contact, those types of things really makes a difference. And it makes a difference to anybody, right? How many times do we just pass people by because we're on our phone and we're not making eye contact? And it's funny, I was just telling a group of ladies, I have an accountability group that we are talking with, and we're reading this book together. And I told them, I said, it's funny. Now I understand when Donnie and I are out, my husband Donnie and I are out, doesn't matter where we are, people come and talk to us and they'll ask us things like, where do we find this? Like at a store. And we're like, we don't work here, but I think it's down this aisle. I've decided it's because we tend to have smiles on our faces, right? That's something we do. We do it on purpose. And I guess we look approachable, and that does make a difference. And it cuts through some of that trauma response because what they're looking for is somebody who's safe. Right. And so when you're making that eye contact, when you're making those, you're paying attention, you're listening,
Hmm.
those are really important things. And we think kids miss those things, but they don't. Kids catch it all. And they know. I mean, if you watch a family where the kids are running around and acting out and they're pushing their parents' buttons, they're doing it on purpose, right?
Yeah, we talk about they're crying for attention or
They're
something.
crying for attention.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so sometimes all it takes is that smile and a little bit of engagement. And then that just opens those doors. So yeah, I love that you watch that stuff because I tend to do that same thing. I like to watch what people are doing and I'm always, cheerful and happy with kids and I like to smile and, wave at them. So
Yeah. I've been known to walk up behind a dad and pat him on the back and say, "Thanks for being a good dad," and then just move on. Just let
hmm
him know I saw
yes.
it.
Yeah.
Uh, but
Yeah.
that's the way it is with a child, and that's where I think I'm picking up from what you're saying. That just that positive interaction with the child,
Yeah.
lets the child know, yes, somebody does care, even though the child may not even be aware of it. It just has that
Right.
kind of an impact.
Yeah.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
Man, you have made my day. This is
I
you know,
appreciate that.
well, one of the fun things about having my podcast is I get to meet some incredible people, and
Oh,
you're in
yeah.
that category. I'm
Well,
telling you, that's. I'm
same
not
thing
just
with
saying
me.
that. I've enjoyed this.
Good.
All right. We could go, we could go on for the longest
Right.
time, and all of that. And I hope that we have generated some thought in some of our listeners.
Yes.
So
Yes.
I'm going to be putting some information on the show notes so
Mm-hmm.
that folks can learn a little bit more about this and what they can
Perfect.
do. So that's great. Please, I'm not trying to close down too early. What else can we talk about that's in this?
Well, I mean, I just think that having people like you let me come and talk about my foster kids, I try and get onto a variety of podcasts so that I
Yeah.
reach a lot of different people. And I don't always just pick podcasts, right, that are about foster care. I
Yeah.
really do try and get on one. So I love what your theme was, and that's why I asked to be on here because I feel like we need hope in general, right?
Yes.
We
Oh,
need
yes.
hope in general, especially right now. Our country is just in turmoil. We don't know where to look, and it's hard. I mean, I fall into that trap. I find that I have to kind of lift myself out. And so knowing that we can make positive impacts is so important.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what I want your listeners and your viewers to know is there is something you can do. It may
Hmm.
be not for a foster family. It may be for somebody else. Maybe you love animals. Maybe you love gardening, whatever. But there's something you can do to
Hmm.
make a positive impact in
Yeah.
somebody's life, even if it is just smiling at them or patting them on the back and saying, wow, you really handled that well. I mean, how many times as a parent do we look around feeling like we're being criticized
Mm.
and not being told how well we do?
Yeah.
I'm one of those where if I leave a Yelp review, I only leave positive reviews because so many people need negative reviews and they don't leave those positive reviews. If I have a good experience somewhere, I want them to know I had a good experience and I want other people to know.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, so, whatever you can do in your own realm to make yourself and others feel good and have some hope, I think is just really
Yeah.
important.
And by the way, another dimension of that is if you do have children around you and they see you acting out in a positive way, responding,
Yes.
that yeah,
Yes. Yeah.
that's another
Yeah.
example for them.
Yeah. Our kid is now 23, but growing up, Scout held the door for everybody and anybody walking through. I mean, we would have to like grab them away from a restaurant because they would have held the door for everybody that was coming in on a Sunday morning after church, right? And like that was just something they saw us do and then they just love to do it. Well, they're 23 now and they still hold the door
Yeah.
open for people, right? It
Yes.
is. It is contagious. It
Hmm.
can be contagious
Yeah.
is serving others, looking at others in ways of
Yeah.
serving.
I tell people we need to be in the hope business. We need to be. I'm trying to
Yeah.
think. One guest had something along that line. That we need to be people who are
Yeah.
involved in that at every level.
Yeah, yeah.
Hope brokers. That's what he called it. Hope
Oh,
brokers.
I love that. That is
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
Yes.
By the way, he was the president, or is the president of one of the community colleges that I used to work in
Oh,
my previous life, and
yeah.
Jimmy's just such a great guy, and I watched him advance, by the way, from being just a classroom teacher. He taught machining to now he's
Oh,
president of that particular college.
yeah.
It's great to know him. But again, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, he's in that hope business. He's a hope broker.
Yeah.
All right. I was just trying to look down at my notes and see if I've covered everything. You have brought a lot of great information out. All right. Well, I have enjoyed this
I
time
have
with you.
two. I have two. I really do enjoy it.
So
Yes.
you live in Indiana,
Mm-hmm.
okay, and I'm down here in Alabama.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Well, anything else you want to add before I wrap up?
No, I think we've covered lots.
Okay, great.
I just
Um,
hope people have some hope.
yeah, I, I, uh, I invite you anytime you want to be a guest on this podcast,
Oh,
please
thank you.
just let me know. And I
Yeah,
reserve the right to ask in the future for you to come back and let's,
absolutely. Absolutely.
okay.
Yes.
All right. Well, friends, thank you for joining Sharon and I as together we journey to hope. I trust in some
Mhm.
small way we've encouraged you to discover, sustain, or regain hope through this effort. I invite you to contact me if you have any questions or comments, or if you wish to share with me something you've experienced in your journey to hope. My email is info@ourjourneytohope.com. That's info@ourjourneytohope.com. And please share this podcast with someone whose hope is being challenged. I look forward to sharing more with you soon. Again, I'm Dr. Dave Layton, and thank you for listening. And until our next episode, remember, we give all glory to God the Father.